Hello and welcome to our third Global Educate webinar. And I'm delighted to welcome Paul Shotton. Now, Paul is a lecturer, a consultant, and a researcher. He today is going to share with us how he's been thinking about using AI and using AI in some of his university teaching. Now, I know for most of my Globe Educate colleagues, university teaching is not something they do, but I know, having spoken with Paul about this, that there is stuff that he's been doing easily transferable and useful for what we do in our classrooms. Paul, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And indeed, as you said, a lot of my experience has been in higher education and teaching and training in higher education. And now more recently, I'm quite busy working with professionals in the field. But I think fundamentally, if we're preparing people for future careers and preparing people for the labor market, the role of artificial intelligence, both as a tool of support and a technology that we all need to adopt and understand, is something very relevant for the classroom across all levels. And of course, on a secondary point, not only is it a skill we have to teach, but it's a skill that we need to acquire in order to be able to teach, as well as a skill we need to acquire to improve the quality of our teaching as well, all in the knowledge of its limitations right now, anyway. So yeah, no, thank you very much for having me. Maybe I'll just kick off and go straight on into my introduction. And I just wanted to talk about my specialization is in public affairs, and public affairs is an interesting field. We can say public affairs, advocacy, government relations, corporate affairs, however you want to name it. It's largely around this act of communicating and engaging with policymakers, legislators, but also in a broader sense with the community and other stakeholders, people who have a stake in your business or in your issues or in your environmental movement or other campaign. And it's a young profession. It's one that few people who practice have been educated to do. And it's one that requires very little qualification in order to be a practitioner. You fundamentally have to just call yourself a lobbyist in order to be a lobbyist. This raises, of course, many problems around the quality and the ethics of the practice. And it also raises questions around, of course, what you need to know to be a lobbyist. What knowledge, skills, tools, tasks, deliverables do you have to be able to acquire and deliver in order to be an effective practitioner? So for me, this has been interesting. My background's in political affairs. And as I developed educational programs, I taught public affairs within a European Studies program in the Netherlands. And I've taught it also within graduate degree programs and executive master's programs. And in all cases, I've really been interested in taking a very practical and applied approach. So I'm very convinced by this applied teaching, problem-based learning approach and case studies, etc. So, it has existed within some of these programs as individual courses. And in some rare cases, there are degree programs in European public affairs or global public affairs or national public affairs. But still, this is by far the exception to the rule. And so indeed, I think it's interesting then to think to yourself, well, if you have to deliver this and teach it, and I've sort of slowly but surely been looking at, within my research as well as within delivering graduate programs or designing graduate programs, I've been trying to figure out what it is that people need to learn and design those programs. So you have to design a body of knowledge, you have to understand the labor market and the people themselves. And like I said, it's a relatively young profession. And myself, I studied by looking indeed at really looking very practically at the campaigns and what people were doing to try and exert influence, and a lot of case studies looking at what happened over time and the different actors and the strategies, etc. And that really gave me a sort of nuanced picture. And I realized that knowing about the institutions, for example, knowing about policymaking was by no means enough. And you needed to start to fill those gaps by looking either within the institutions at how they function or at the different tools you needed to be able to engage. So how do you decide what issue to engage on? How do you know who you need to talk to? How do you know what your messages are? How do you know how to write a position paper or develop a strategy? And all of those blanks are really what drove me forward over the last years now in teaching. So indeed, within the universities in the Netherlands, it's very much a diversion still. So in the Netherlands, where I've been teaching, but also in other systems, they've really kept this distinction between the research and the applied sciences perspective. So in the research universities, it's all about the why, very theoretical aspect, understanding dynamics and processes and trying to understand what is taking place within this lobbying world. And in the applied sciences perspective, it's about teaching people how to do it. And that's where I've really taken pleasure. And that's really created the base to nearly everything I do now. So I really sort of adopted this approach, both in my training of professionals or in juniors, but you still have to figure out what the how is. And that was missing, because if you're a doctor, that's quite straightforward. There's a very clear syllabus. And you have to sort of create that syllabus for yourself. But definitely within that context of teaching the how, we've had to develop methodologies and models to break the system down into its component steps of the knowledge and skills and tools. And we've had to apply then teaching practices, simulations, and practical tasks. And this is really the first step, because if I talk about AI, before you can apply AI, you have to know what you're going to apply it to and what you need to know. So in that sense, we need the model to understand what it is that the knowledge, skills, and abilities and the tasks and deliverables that people need to actually be able to create and acquire. We then need to really understand those tools, and then we can start thinking about how AI can change those, either the tools and how you use them, or the workflows of the different tasks that you're doing, and how you can then apply these tools and technology. And I make a big distinction already between, I say you can write a position paper, or you can map a stakeholder on a piece of paper. You can do it in Excel. You can use a more sort of interactive piece of software, Airtable or Smartsheets. And then you can use AI to do more sophisticated big data analysis. So there's a sliding scale there. And AI is a very broad term. So I like to say, you can use large language models like ChatGPT or Gemini to support more traditional tasks. And then you can use very sophisticated applications of AI further down the road. And of course, there's further very sophisticated, like predicting voting behavior, profiling huge communities of different individuals. It's all the very exciting, cutting edge, complex side of AI. But frankly, I think we need to take a step back and start focusing on the more straightforward applications that will probably have a much larger impact on your day-to-day life. And all of this is, of course, that if you're learning to acquire a skill and a knowledge to be able to practice, then I think you need to also acquire the understanding of the basics. Because if the AI is going to support you in creating a better position paper, for example, then you need to, of course, also understand what a good position paper is, to be able to critically reflect on the output that you're getting from the AI, and to think about how you're going to engage and have those conversations with the ChatGPT or the Gemini that will bring you to create something more effective. So that's a little bit, I think, the philosophy also that underpins this sort of project that I did. And it's definitely, like I said, something I've really taken on board, this Dutch fondness for the applied sciences way of working. And I'm sure that that also exists in the UK as well.
I like hearing you talk, Paul, about knowing what you're doing in the first place. And whenever I talk to somebody who's new to AI, my recommendation when they start exploring it is to explore it with something they know a lot about already, and then they can get a real measure of how good or not it is. And I think that's a really good way to approach it, is to approach it with an area that you are very comfortable with the amount of knowledge you've got about it already.
Yeah. And I think that that's a very good point. I was just talking yesterday to a group of professionals, And they were also, very few of them were making use, in a room of 15 people, 2 people were really using it day to day, ChatGPT, to support their work. So it shows that there is a huge knowledge gap still there in terms of acquiring these tools and understanding how to interact with them, how to think, like I said before, if you think about a task, I want to write a summary report on a topic. You have to think about, well, what's the process I go through to get the information, to research it, to analyze it, to draft a report, and to review it and finalize it and submit it. And then you look at that process and you think, indeed, once you've understood that process, you can think, how can I use AI? In what way can it support me in each of those steps? Can it help me design the outline and the framework? Can it help me summarize the content? Can it help me identify key arguments and messaging? Can it help me identify evidence? Can it help me formulate recommendations? But people need to think about that, I think, very much in a stepwise sort of flow approach, because we often make the mistake of asking GPT, here's a document, give me a position paper or give me a brief. But it's not so good at doing that huge leap. So it needs to work step by step. But it can help you actually even figure out what are the steps. So, it's once you get that mindset in place that you can think, okay, I have a new task. So help me break down what is this task and what is it I'm trying to do. And then how do I break that down into stepwise process and then work through the steps, giving it the information and the feedback it needs to craft something that's more than just a generic piece, something that's actually very specific and relevant. And maybe one last comment about the teaching is that, when you talk to groups of people in companies as well, many companies say, well, data privacy requirements mean that you can't use it. We're worried about losing information, and that's a legitimate concern. Some companies are building their own sort of GPTs internally. But I always point out as well that you have to be careful that there is a competitive disadvantage there as well. So those who know how to use it versus those who don't know how to use it. And that we see in the labor market is creating sort of a very rapidly expanding knowledge gap, the haves and the have-nots. And I think that, whether you're a business who wants to be competitive or an NGO who wants to campaign and be successful, or if you're an individual who wants to be attractive on the labor market, this is a skill you must acquire. And there is no choice about that, frankly. So I think we need to be integrating it. And by doing so, we're not cheating, in my opinion, at all. What we're doing is actually we're changing the nature of what we need to learn. So we need to acquire the knowledge to use the tool. And then when it comes to grading and assessment, we need to then revise our expectations on the output. A rough, ugly policy brief is no longer a pass. It can have no spelling mistakes, and the structure must be very good. And then, what you're looking for then is indeed to see evidence of that dialogue and the research and the quality of the information. So the number of sources, the quality of the analysis, the recommendations, the advice, that strategic thinking, which was something we wouldn't expect at a more junior level, is now something that we can skip to, in a sense, that the earlier sort of foundational skills now come quicker, and we can expect much earlier those more advanced skills. And that's my opinion, but I think it still needs to be tested a little bit as well in practice. So moving on, indeed, I keep talking about structure, so just give me a second to reflect on that. If I'm teaching something that's relatively new, we've had to reflect ourselves on what it is you need to know. So you're building a body of knowledge, which in effect says, what are the learning outcomes and what are the things that people need to know how to do to be a practitioner. So we put together a 7-step model, but it actually is growing and evolving over time. But the idea is that the buckets of knowledge and skills and tools can be compartmentalized, and you can create a sort of sequential process that takes you through most of the core tasks of being a professional in public affairs or advocacy. And to do that, you need to be able to prioritize between the different campaigns, to make choices about what you're going to work on and what you're not going to work on. You need to be able to formulate objectives, clear objectives that make your campaign measurable and focused. Otherwise, you're going to try and achieve too much, or you won't know what you're achieving and what you're not achieving. You're going to need to gather information to feed into the system, research and understanding what's happening in the policymaking environment, what's going on, who are the actors. You then need to formulate your position, you know. You need to, and that's usually, these are all interconnected. It's a logical sequence of things. Once you know what your priorities are, you choose a piece of legislation. You then formulate your objectives, what you want to achieve with that. Once you know what those objectives are, it means you know what the problem is with it and what the solutions are. And therefore, you can write your messages. Well, this is what the problem is, and this is what needs to be done about it. And here's my evidence. And here's what you need to do with this information. You can then take that and package it into different documents, well, a policy brief or a press release, a position paper. You then communicate that to stakeholders. You need to know who's influential and agrees with you, who's influential disagrees with you, what other interest groups exist, NGOs, what media, journalists are relevant, what other influences exist. And you package all of that together then into a strategy. And then you manage that strategy with an action plan and you evaluate it. And so this methodology then is a series of steps that you have to work through, and each one has its own toolkit. And you know, that toolkit could be a SMART objectives or a message house template. It could be a SMART objectives or OKR objectives. It could be a position paper, a policy brief, a press release, an infographic, a video, etc. And then the question presents itself, of course, how do you use technology to help you more effectively develop these things? And indeed, you know, I'll just take a step back there and I'll just mention again that, you know, you're drawing then in doing this from many different disciplines. And if many lobbyists are actually coming from law or political science, we all have to learn new skills. I've had to learn enormously about communication science, public relations, and learn a lot about business administration, as I call it, budgeting and project management skills. So we all need to draw from these different disciplines to create a more rounded profile that makes us more effective. But of course, we have to figure out as well what it is that we as individuals are stronger at. And, you know, I'm more of an introvert, so I enjoy, you know, the nitty-gritty of policymaking and the nitty-gritty of rules and the nitty-gritty of project management, and others are more sort of extrovert communicators who are much more about networking and relationship building. So indeed, we're putting together these different disciplines and we're drawing from them to then create stronger tools. And when I talked about stakeholder mapping, that comes from public relations. When I talk about action plans and Gantt charts, that comes from business administration. And I'm applying those tools then to policymaking and to legislation. But you could just as well apply them to building a marketing campaign or a public relations campaign or any other big project, you know, that you would acquire. So they're very transferable skills as well, very horizontal skills. So like I mentioned, indeed, you know, we then develop this mindset saying, okay, our curriculum or what we're trying to teach people is across this framework, this 7-step methodology. And then for each of them, we need to start developing tools. And I mentioned at the beginning that historically, we've been developing tools, maybe it shows our age, but, you know, lots of things in Word, documents, templates. So we're all about templating. So I don't write a position paper for you, but what I do is I do an outline of what one should look like. What information goes where and how it's structured. And the same could then be done for a policy brief, or the same could be done for what we call an issue tracker, a one-pager that gives you information, the essential information. Or in this case, a campaign Gantt chart, or in this another case, we could have examples of SMART objectives, and we could talk about the different ways and what the ingredients, the recipe to a good objective. And these tools have historically largely been in Excel. And now increasingly what we're seeing is that customers are using or wanting to use tools that allow them to work as a team and try and strengthen that collaboration. So we have things like Smart Sheets and Airtable, which in effect is Excel, but Excel with interfaces. So people can then, who are running campaigns, can update, introduce a new campaign into the table or through a form, or they can open up an existing campaign and edit the information on that form, but they don't need to manage the whole form. Or a manager can go in and have a look at an overview of all of the different campaigns, where they're happening, what themes, which departments, how much threat or opportunity is being felt. So we're already seeing this evolution where people are needing to go from paper or Word or Office to more interactive tools, Trello, Jira, these sort of card-based project management, Gantt chart-based systems, where you create tickets and you give people responsibilities for tasks and get them done. Smart sheets, like I just mentioned. There's a whole wealth of tools there that we are starting to need to learn. So already, the reality is that many practitioners don't even have the paper versions in place. And now they're being asked to move to these more sophisticated tools. I'm quite good at this, I think. I've been doing it for a while, but I'm relatively good with Excel. But I myself, I just built an Airtable, which is this more sophisticated Excel table with interfaces for a client. And I ended up having to watch the videos, the instructional videos, because I couldn't figure it out intuitively. So it goes to show that, it's not necessarily a very straightforward process for people who have no background in project management or they don't know how to use Excel. And the next step then becomes, AI. So what can you do with AI? And even the tools I just mentioned, like Airtable, they have AI support that help you build these things. But if you don't really understand what you're building, then the AI doesn't necessarily give you the output you're looking for. And you can get in a muddle more than you can actually find that AI particularly helpful. But let me move on then, indeed.
Paul, just before you move on, can I just ask you about your view then of the necessity to start teaching younger children about AI, about its strengths, about its weaknesses, before they get to you and your colleagues, if that's the way they're going to go, or the workplace. They need to have a basic understanding at least before they leave school.
Absolutely. And I think it's a real dilemma, isn't it? As a teacher, you have to say, to what extent are we going to be helping the students if we're creating also a negative mindset towards this technology? If I use this technology, I'll be found out and I'll be punished, sort of ideas. So indeed, I think when I talked about it already, if you look at the day-to-day life of a worker, someone working in this sort of knowledge economy, then you could ask yourself, well, okay, maybe 20% of my day is spent just managing emails and communicating and organizing my day-to-day. And there already you could say, what application can, learning on AI or learning to use large language models play in that? For me, translating messages, responding to emails, structuring and proofreading and editing my correspondence. So all of that work has now become hugely, well, I hesitate. I wouldn't say I've gone from, using 20% to 10% of my time, but the quality of my correspondence and output has really been increased. Maybe the quantity has also increased. That's the problem with technology, We used to write letters and now we write emails. And so we send 10 times more emails than we do, or 100 times more emails than we do letters. But I think in that initial area, acquiring the skills and the understanding of how you can use these models to, reflect on a task, break the task down, acquire knowledge in order to be able to complete the task. I use it enormously for things, if I have to do marketing and sales emails, I think about I ask questions around understanding the sales and marketing process, understanding the steps in that process, understanding what makes a good written email in a marketing email, and then working step by step to draft that email, etc. So I suddenly go from making it up a little bit or looking for some best practice to taking a much more rigorous approach. And that, I think, is a real core element, isn't it? I think if you want to teach younger people, it's not just prompt engineering, it's also about, well, what is the task? What is the output I'm looking for? How do I get there? and having those conversations with the AI to try and acquire it in a critical fashion and reflecting on whether you're getting the right information, you're going down the right road. Because sometimes you find yourself going the wrong way as well. So indeed, that sort of skill, I think, sits at the heart of it. And if you have that skill, then when it comes to looking at, oh, I have to do a stakeholder map. So, okay, I had a lecture on it and I was given a tool, but let me use the AI to better understand my mapping. What is it I'm trying to achieve? What makes a good map and a bad map? Oh, now I need to rank someone for influence. How do I how do I do that measurement? Give me some advice. And it's very bad still at doing the actual ranking, but it can be very good at telling you, what is the indicator and how you can measure it. So it's a very smart sort of support system, but of course you have to know its limitations. Indeed. So I myself then, like this slide really is all about that, really. It's really saying, okay, so now let's look at how we can apply these tools to all of the different aspects of our work, and understanding where it's effective and where it's less effective and where it can really provide added value and, and where it's weak. And for example, with me, I see very quickly that if you ask it to evaluate or to make subjective assessments or comparative assessments, it's not very good at that yet. Rank this list of 15 different things in order of their impact or their cost. And it's not great at that unless you can really give it some tangible metrics or some numbers that it can then organize. But if you're trying to use more intangible things like, my ability to influence something, it really is very weak at that. So you have to know that that's where it won't give you that added value. But just on this slide, I gave the example of, draft a smart KPI for a webinar on teaching a class on AI in public affairs, and it can give you some ideas, and then you can have a conversation about what is different kinds of KPI. Is it a quantitative KPI or qualitative KPI? And which one should I use and how often should I use them, etc. So identifying the use case and identifying the workflow is central to this idea of applying the AI. And another element then, so this all fed together really into the experiment I want to talk about. And that experiment was that I was thinking, okay, one of the core things that a junior needs to do is to do monitoring, which means that they need to go out and do some field research, attend a parliamentary hearing. They need to write down what happened and make a report that they will then pass on to their client or to their manager to tell them the essence of what happened. So I thought, and I took the approach of developing a standard operating procedure. Actually, I had a reflection with ChatGPT about what are the best ways of building a methodology for breaking down the process. And there were a few alternatives. I landed on an SOP. I wasn't very familiar with SOPs, so I explored what it was and how you write them and what makes for a good one or a bad one. And then indeed, together, we reflected on, what it is what are the steps and how to break them down to doing these tasks. And you create a sheet. In this case, I created a document that started out with defining the purpose of this exercise, the tools you need, whose roles and responsibilities, and then the step-by-step process of, okay, so now you need to identify the meeting. And where do you go? Well, you need to go to the Parliament's website, you need to look at the agenda, then you need to go to the Parliament's website where they have the web streaming and download that part of the meeting. You don't need to download the video, so you just need to get the settings right, download an audio file. You then have that audio file and you work through the process step by step. And that's really something that's already a slight evolution, because when I was younger, you would attend the meeting, but now you can watch them online. So you don't even have to attend anymore. But then the question presents itself, what tools and AI applications can we bring into this to not just facilitate the process, make it easier, but also potentially improve the quality of the output? So in this case, I thought, okay, And I did this in a sort of free way. I thought, okay, let's make this the free way. So the free way for me was, let's use easily available tools that you don't have to really, in my initial expectation, you don't have to, pay extra for, buy additional licenses, etc. So all the sources were publicly available. So the information was for free. We then, downloaded the audio. And in this case, we then had to transcribe it. So I thought, okay, well, the simplest way to transcribe an audio file is to do it in Word. You can transcribe it in Word, and it creates then a document with an overview of what took place. But then you realize, you look at the output and you realize, well, the output is full of mistakes. It's not very good at names in particular, because the names are from people from all over Europe and the spelling is difficult. So the first problem you have to solve then is indeed to figure out how can we correct the name. So you ask then, without editing, you say, you have to design a prompt that says, based upon this list of members, so you can give it a link to the website where it lists all the member of the committee, or the agenda where it lists all the speakers of the day. Based upon this source document, correct the names and nothing else in this transcript. So don't change it otherwise. And then you have a new version of the transcript, which is actually then quite accurate. It's a verbatim transcript of who said what, and the names are correct. The next step is, well, okay, now we need to create a monitoring report. So, how do we try and also, with a view to keeping this consistent, how do we tell ChatGPT or the LLM what output we're looking for, And so you could write a rather complicated prompt saying, I want a monitoring report that has, a section on this, a section on that. And this is the following structure. So I do that often with smaller things. So if you say, I want to write an executive summary and draw the information from, the conclusion or from these 3 or 4 sections of the document, put them together, and that's the executive summary. That works very well. But in this sense, we said, okay, here's a template, as you can see in the bottom of this slide. Here's a template for a monitoring report. And now I want you to structure and summarize the information in the transcript into this format. And it does that rather well. And there's some interesting things you can play around with then. So people will, of course, then explore this process, and they'll see that the output is not identical each time. There's variation, even though it's the same prompt and the same source material. But fundamentally, you're already getting a pretty good first draft. In a sense, it's taking you from 0 to 80 in seconds as opposed to days. And there's a lot of interesting opportunities there to reflect. You can reflect on, well, what have you asked them to do? In a report, it's often the who, what, where, when, how. What took place? Who was there? Where were they? What were they talking about? Etc. So, often you can, and this is where I think you also have to think about what is the capability. If you're just doing a summary, traditionally, as a human, you might just do a shortened version of who said what in chronological order. That's what, we're maybe better constructed as human beings to doing. It would take us the least time possible to do that, to do a very brief, one paragraph on what each person said that day, and maybe then, what they said and what they will do next, or what they asked for in particular, or some sort of conclusion for each one. What I realized is that, well, in ChatGPT, it could say, actually summarize the position of each individual over the course of the whole meeting. So if they've spoken 4 or 5 times, you could ask them to say, summarize what they said, give me an indication of their sentiment or their position overall based upon the whole contribution they made to that meeting. And that, for us, is a very difficult thing to do. That's actually then drawing information from across 15 pages and summarizing that in a different order. So in terms of summarization skills, it's a fantastic tool, and it loves to have a template because that can give it structure. And the output then, it can look at the agenda and other documents, and it will know when the meeting took place, where it took place, who was present, what they said. That it can do very, very well with a high degree of accuracy. And you can, of course, give additional prompts like the tone you would like it to use, a formal professional tone, the word count you'd like to use, or even break down what individual information you would like to be included in the summary, you know. The next more difficult element is then if you're going to the next level. So say, okay, that was a task for a junior, and now the junior's had a lot of his work done for him by the ChatGPT. What would have been, what would make for a more sophisticated document? Same with a research paper or policy brief. You know, what makes for, well then, if the data collection and the summarization and description, the heart of the research paper has been really accelerated and improved and taken to the next level, well, then our interest turns to the analysis, the conclusions and recommendations, and what next. So there as well, we see that ChatGPT is actually, and this I've seen an exponential change in the last year in terms of its ability to recommend action. So you say, what, based upon this domain, what sort of action would you take? And in your template, you can give some guidance and say, well, you know, we would like action about follow-up to the monitoring. Should I do more monitoring, less monitoring, the same amount of monitoring? Should we set up meetings with people to follow up on that? So you give it a framework and it will draw from that and make recommendations. It can look on the internet and it can identify potential upcoming events in the agenda. It can look at the policy process because it knows that very well. Knows that better than me, and I teach it, and it knows it better than me in the finer detail, and tell you what are the next steps in the process. So the monitoring email now starts to contain recommended actions, you know, and for example, a projection into the future about what's coming next and what you can do about it. And that suddenly becomes a much higher added value document with a lot more value for the individual. So we get very interesting debates and conversations amongst the students about, well, you know, what contribution will I make? Well, then you need to critically appraise this recommended action and reflect upon, is it aligned with the impact and importance of this development? You know, is that the right kind of follow-up action to do? Did it identify the right events? Do I need to add more events, etc.? And of course, that comes only after you've revised and reviewed very carefully its summary to see, did it really give me the right summary? And is it focused on the right points? Is it salient and relevant to me? So you see that the critical reflective role of the individual really goes up here. And they have to review the content and reflect on the strategy and reflect on the analysis and think about what to do next. And so that was a little bit the idealized view of how it would have worked. But the reality is that when I did it, you know, it was a lot more complicated. We did this over 3 hours with what I would have expected to be the perfect demographic, a 26-year-old graduate, you know, master's degree student doing another master's. Turns out that, you know, when we first do it, you know, already there's some people who didn't have functioning computers. They had an iPad, so they had to then join someone else. Then you have some people on Mac, some people on Windows, some people with or without fully functional versions of Office. So we had to then identify alternative solutions for transcribing. There are different service providers, and we were able to do that. But the whole thing becomes a journey of sort of firefighting. And then we discover that only 3 people in the room had a subscription to ChatGPT. And of the remaining, you know, 20 odd, at least 15 of them only had very limited understanding, and some had never used it. So we really, when you talk about that baseline understanding, you know, half the room or 3/4 of the room didn't even have any experience really using the tool. So I should have actually had a whole session before this about just what is GPT, how do you use it, what can it do in different aspects of your work, to lay the ground rules, you know.
And you haven't even touched upon people's view of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. You're just talking about a technical starting point there.
Absolutely. And prior to that, I had, of course, presented what is monitoring and how do you do it. So that was done before. They had some insight already into what was this task and why it's valuable and what are the main templates and tools available. So they had some knowledge there. But indeed, there was a lot of mindset about, well, you know, this is not allowed by my employer, and therefore I shouldn't be doing this. sort of thing, or it's some form of cheating. So indeed, there was a lot of learning as we do it, and it's fun. As a teacher, it's very fun to look at it, and then you realize people are stuck and they don't quite understand. And that may also be because they've never used an SOP before. They've never worked in a stepwise process before. This is a new approach. That makes sense to me because I designed it, but to them isn't so easy. So you have to bring people back to the document. They go away and they click wildly on things, and then they go down a rabbit hole, and then you have to bring them back and say, well, actually, which step are you on? Are you still on step one? Have you done step one? Oh, no, I jumped ahead. So, okay, go back to step one and work step by step. And of course, I need to then learn from the process and adapt and rewrite the SOP and learn from it. But I think the fundamental objective of demonstrating that people need to think about, the work they do and think, okay, now I'm going to set up a meeting with people, or now I'm going to organize an event, or now I'm going to go write a monitoring report. Those can be then thought of in this sort of sequential process, and they can then reflect upon what tools exist, both AI or non-AI, tools to transcribe, tools to analyze, etc., tools to design more visually pleasing documents, etc. So they have to think about the toolkit as well, and combine these ingredients together.
Paul, you talked about the fact that you realized quite quickly that you perhaps had started too far down the line with this particular project. If you were redesigning another AI enhanced project to do with students, with a different set of students, where would you start the whole process from, do you think, now?
Yeah, well, right from the beginning, I think, indeed, it would start. So yesterday, when I did these workshops with 40-year-old professionals, I realized that when I did the second group, the first question is, so, who has an account on ChatGPT or a similar device, and who has a paid account, and who's allowed to use it, and how much experience do you have using it, and what do you use it for? So all of that initial conversation to sort of set the baseline about what is the current level of experience and knowledge with the tool that we're intending to use, and then to address that baseline through some experimentation, indeed. And like you may have mentioned in other sessions, how does the tool work? How best to work with the tool? How best to craft a prompt, etc. From my perspective and from the best practice that I've identified. And then from there, introduce the different use cases. Let's apply this knowledge now to monitoring in this example and go through the journey from there, indeed. Linking back then, you say, okay, then, we understand the tool. Now we need to understand the sources of information. We need to understand the templates. We need to understand all of these different elements that we're going to put together in this exercise.
And I'm guessing that in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, that aspect of your project won't need to be done because people will have caught up generally. It's just this phase at the moment, isn't it, where there is a gap.
Well, I mean, I'm doing a lot of this work with clients as well, where we build these tools. And now I realize that I can build a tool once I built it once. It's quite easy to build it a second time. I then have to realize I need to tailor it to the context of the organization and the people. So you have to then adapt it to the level of understanding and ability of the organization, on average, as average. And then there's this huge question about, well, how do we get people to embed this knowledge and use it? So is it enough for me to just say, this is ChatGPT and this is a tool you should use? No. Then we could do an exercise and they'll have some insight. So that's maybe one step further. They've applied the knowledge and they've critically reflected on it. But then they may well go straight back to the previous way of working or do that. So then you have to apply it twice, 3 times, 4 times with the feedback. In the knowledge that when you're preaching to a group, you'll have, the bell curve of 3 will just go with it. 4, 5, 6, or, the middle will follow. And then you'll get 2 or 3 at the end who will categorically refuse. So in the labor market, you either ignore them or or you try and try and address that and support them as they transition reluctantly. Or in America, you might fire them, ask them to go work elsewhere. But that's the sort of the scenario about how you deal with embedding the knowledge in people and their degree of willingness to change their ways of working. Of course, with younger minds, I assume they are potentially more open and willing to adopt it. But certainly 20-year-olds of this day and age are indeed sitting in their, like, they're the generation that are pre-ChatGPT in a way. They're still quite a long way to go before they know what they're doing.
I was going to ask you what were the sort of attitudes towards what you were doing once you said, well, we're going to be using AI? What were the reactions from some of your students?
I think overall there was interest and support for the process, maybe some anxiety and confusion. But generally speaking, I think they acknowledged that this was something that they needed to do, but there was, for various reasons, some reticence, whether that was about whether it's the right thing to do. Am I still learning something doing this? Is it some form of cheating? Am I capable? Do I have the knowledge and skills? I feel insecure because I don't understand this technology. I'm not familiar with it. So all of those sort of reasons, indeed, I think clouded a little bit the experience for them. But at the output, I think it was an enjoyable exercise. And the fact that we had to problem solve, I don't think made me look, sort of less competent as a teacher, but that, we just roll with it and we have to deal with it and enjoy it. And it makes for a very enjoyable teaching experience, I think.
I love that idea of you learning alongside them, and taking stuff from it and reflecting on what you're doing as a professional. I think that's a fantastic example of how to approach incorporating AI in what you do.
Yeah. And so maybe that goes to a sort of another point we could make is that, to what extent are you transparent about how you as a teacher use AI in order to devise these things? So, explaining to the students how I devised the SOP with the assistance of AI and how I ran through this process, before teaching the class. I did it myself. I simulated what we were going to do. And also how I might use it in other ways to support my teaching, and building that understanding. And where I would have thought I was quite open and transparent about it, I think you still see people putting labels on it. So I have this nice example. I think I have it in the slide as well. So if we look at this example here, when I was teaching, I can look at the work of a student, and I can say to myself, okay, well, I've told them to use ChatGPT to support them in developing a position paper. And what you see in effect is, how do I assess the work? And on the left, a student had merely, I think, gone straight from A to Z, A to Z in one leap and asked it to develop a position paper and cut and pasted it in. And I said, but I have given you instructions around how you structure the document, which you haven't inputted into the GPT. I've also talked about layout, content, specificity of information, etc. So what they had delivered was a rather generic document with very little specific evidence, very little specific argumentation for the case study organization they were simulating. The one on the right had done the traditional work, had done a lot of desk research and etc. And so you see that on the one hand, on the left, you have polished language, good structure, the phrasing is good, it's generic. And on the other hand, you have one that has very specific information and rather good information, but poor phrasing, poor structure, and poor language. And so they both have something that they could have benefited. If on the right, they had run it through GPT to proofread it and do the spell checking, and maybe also to have reflected on the structure a bit more, etc. They could have sharpened it up. And the one on the left should have actually put a bit of time into looking at the template and actually creating a text box and putting the logo in and making it a document that credibly belongs to that organization. So I think that's a very nice example of the two different outputs. And my job as a teacher or an educator or as a coach is to is to show them, the limitations of their approach and what they needed to do to take it to the next level, either with or without the tool, depending upon the approach they started with. And, this was an example on my side as well, was I was using then, my students said, oh, but you haven't graded our work yourself. You asked GPT to do the feedback. So in the way I do it is, you have a workshop. If I teach you, you have a workshop that shows you, or even a video lecture, then a workshop that shows you what is a monitoring report, for example, or a position paper, and how you write one. And then they can go away and they write one, and then I give them feedback, and then they go away and then correct it. And I say, by that stage, if I've given you detailed feedback, it should be, the final output, if you apply the feedback, should be a lot improved, and you should pass everything in theory. I can't quite see how you wouldn't, unless you don't apply the feedback or you don't do the work in the first place. So I can't give you any feedback. But what I do then is I look at the position paper, for example, and then I will look at the assessment sheet, and I will dictate my feedback into Word. And I just dictate it. And I find that that's very nice, because I'm looking at the assessment sheet and I'm looking at the Word, and then I'm going through the criteria. And here you see, for example, length, layout, templates, content, visuals, etc. Whatever the assessment are, and I talk about the good and I talk about the less good, and I give recommendations. And that then creates a very long document that I then ask GPT to structure into a series of emails to each group based upon the same headings. So I give it the assessment sheet and say, this is the assessment sheet. Organize the feedback for each group along the assessment headlines and in X, Y, Z. And then that makes for a really consistent set of feedback for each student. But you have to, of course, be cautious that you have to read through it to make sure that it's still relevant. You have to make sure the prompt is very clear, that each group's feedback is for each group and should not be confused and glossed over. But of course, sending that to the students, they look at that and they say, "Oh, that's not Paul Shotton's work. That's ChatGPT's work. He hasn't reviewed my position paper. He just loaded it into GPT." So it's interesting, And if you ask GPT to review some of these documents, it can give some feedback, but it's not quite there yet. So we still have.
What do you say to them, Paul, when they say that to you? What do you come back with?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I gave the right answer, but indeed I explained the process. I said, well, actually, no, indeed I dictated the feedback and it was me, but GPT proofread and edited it for me. But indeed, it's funny, because if the student misinterprets the feedback or I miscommunicate the feedback, it could be my fault as much as theirs. So if there is that misunderstanding, then so you give the feedback in writing, and then they come back to you with a series of questions, and then I will clarify my feedback and they will understand, because they'll say, oh, but you got it wrong. They look at this and will say, so GPT misunderstood or gave me generic feedback, and the reason I don't understand the feedback is that it's the wrong kind of feedback. You see what I mean? They will blame the GPT's error, and then they will realize afterwards that I will clarify and say, well, actually, this feedback is correct. It's maybe just not communicated in the right way, but this is a valid point, and you need to take it into account and make the changes. But they will attribute the misunderstanding to GPT and not to a miscommunication between the lecturer and the student.
And how much time do you think this has saved you doing it this way?
Well, on the one hand, I think it saves quite, considerable amounts of time. But it also means that my feedback has gone from maybe, sort of an email written, I'm relatively structured, but to something a lot more structured, a lot more consistent, and all the spelling and all the rest and all of that is dealt with. So the quality of the feedback, I think, is significantly higher and significantly more consistent and more detailed, because instead of some small notes, you can see I've got 5-6 pages of feedback I'm generating as I do this across a group or a class. So, if you make good use and you structure it well, I think you get a much higher quality output.
And as a result
from it.
As a result, the students' work, their final piece of work, is of a much higher quality.
Yes, that's for sure. I've seen now over the last 2 years that the quality of the position papers, etc., are getting very good. And frankly, I've shown these to professionals, and sometimes the standard is now higher than those,
Wow.
quite often higher than those within the organizations themselves.
Mm.
And that's just a testament to the fact that, yeah, this old approach, new approach,
Mm.
old toolkit, new toolkit really makes a big difference in terms of documents, especially on things like, length as well, and to be succinct and to communicate clearly and succinctly is always a challenge. And that can be really facilitated by these, to try and do a 2-page position paper as opposed to a 10-page one, which many organizations do.
Do you find, or do you feel you're spending more time laboring the critical analysis point, the necessity for the critical analysis point with your students?
Yes, indeed. So, indeed, you look at the student population, and, a lazier student will indeed initially will cut and paste. I mean, actually, to be honest, the first step is that I teach often rather international student groups. So you'll get those who are used to just sort of cramming at the end and passing the exam. So they're already completely traumatized at the fact that we're doing continuous assessment and they're getting feedback, and they have to work consistently over time. So that, I think, is already a very important element, that we're working sequentially through this process to develop a campaign bit by bit, getting feedback, and then finalizing, moving on to the next step, building up a journey, building up a series of deliverables. And then indeed, once they've assimilated that, we're then looking at indeed that exploratory journey about how they can apply these, use GPT to summarize, use GPT to write a KPI. You say, I need to build an action plan. And then I need to organize an event in the European Parliament. What would be the task? So I show them how they can have conversations about what are the tasks required to organize and deliver an event. And it's very good at those sorts of things. And you have a conversation, and you will suddenly have a list of 10 very good things. And then you'll have another conversation about, well, of these 10 tasks, which ones would be the most crucial for developing a KPI? And then for those 3 crucial elements, which would be best served by having a quantitative KPI versus a qualitative KPI, and suggest some different KPIs that I could use for these. So you're working step by step, and they're learning and doing that, and they're really seeing that indeed they're having this sort of very effective assistant, giving them options and ideas, but they have to choose, make choices. And I'm helping them afterwards, saying, well, okay, but I'm looking now, and you've got an action plan with 50 KPI. No human being is ever going to be able to do that, and they're all incredibly sophisticated, and you're going to spend your life and hiring millions of consultants just to measure what you're not doing because you've got such a complicated plan. So that sort of dialogue and conversation is still there around what it is they've created, what makes it good, what makes it feasible, what makes it the quality piece of work that you can want. But it's already, where in the past I would be lucky with a bare bones action plan from a 20-year-old. Now you've got quite a sophisticated document delivered to you.
So, Paul, if as a colleague of yours, if I came to you and said, I've noticed you've started to use AI in your teaching and with your students, I'm interested in doing that as well. What would your piece of advice to me as a starter on this would be?
Oof, it's an interesting question. There's so many different places that you could use it in. It's a little bit hard to say. So I can see that it's overwhelming, indeed, as a question about where do you start. Indeed, where I initially myself started was actually in designing the course. So I used it to help me write learning outcomes, to think about the structure of the course over the weeks, to talk about the different elements I wanted to do in terms of the practical assignments and the feedback sessions and all of those sorts of things. So course design and assessment design and assessment rubrics and all of that, fantastic.
Do you think I should concentrate on an area that I know pretty well already, or should I be adventurous like you? And
no, I would start on something well. This is a course and this is content I've been doing for a long time.
Yeah.
to start with what you know well, because then you have the ability to judge and revise the quality of the output. You can sort of make those, is this going in the right direction? Because when you start to venture in the areas you know much less well, then you have less ability to reflect on that. And if I said, indeed, start with the design of the course, then the next bit would be actually in designing the exercise. So then think very carefully about a task, a deliverable, a job, a workflow, a use case, something that you want to turn into this case study, where then people can then, apply this technology, break it down into small parts, and indeed think very carefully about, how big a task, it can be, if it's not researching and writing a report, it would be designing an outline for a report. That would be one thing you do, and then that's enough. And then you can then do the next steps, or indeed summarizing or analyzing a document.
So what I'm hearing is stick to an area that you know well, and start with a small part of it that you can use AI with.
Yeah, so think about a task that's part of the curriculum, then choose one element and then ask yourself if that's small enough, and be prepared to cut it down again into something. And then indeed, going back to the point we made earlier, is indeed, that may require first some baseline work just to ensure people are able to access the tool and use it in the first place. So maybe there's some preliminary work needed there. So everyone is, when you say open up your LLM, they're able to do that, and that you have then, they can then start on the task, indeed.
Paul, thank you so much for today. I've really enjoyed listening to you share your story, share your adventure, and I know you will have other areas that you're going to take it into. If anybody would like to get in touch with you directly about what you've shared, I'm guessing LinkedIn would probably be the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can even see my email address in this example here. So, but indeed, they're very welcome to reach out on LinkedIn, or actually my email address is just paul@advocacystrategy.com. So very welcome to send me an email as well. And if they want this SOP or any other materials, happy to send them on. I'm always very keen. So yeah, no problem at all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.